The city was alive that evening, a pulsing heart of activity wrapped in the golden embrace of twilight. Street vendors called out to passers-by, offering everything from spicy kebabs to glimmering trinkets. Cars honked impatiently at intersections, while streetlights began to flicker on, one by one, casting long shadows across the pavement. At the edge of a quiet park, where the noise of the city softened into a gentle hum, a woman stood out among the crowd. She wasn't just beautiful, she was mesmerizing. Her long, jet-black hair cascaded down her back like an inky waterfall, and her flowing white gown seemed to shimmer, catching the last rays of the setting sun. She didn't just walk, she glided, her every step exuding grace and purpose. Beside her stood a man, tall and sturdy, but seemingly ordinary compared to the ethereal presence of the woman. His nervous energy was palpable as he glanced around, clutching a small briefcase tightly. His unease was in stark contrast to the lady's serene demeanor. She seems too perfect for this world, thought a young artist sitting on a nearby bench, sketching the scene in his notebook. Unbeknownst to the pair, two boys lurked in the shadows just beyond the park's entrance. They weren't ordinary boys, brothers who had grown up on the streets, learning to survive by their wits. The older one, Malik, had a sharp, calculating mind, while his younger brother, Samir, followed his lead with blind loyalty. "Look at that bag," Malik whispered, pointing toward the lady's designer handbag. "That thing's worth more than we make in a year. And she's distracted. Easy pickings." Samir hesitated. "I don't know, Malik. Something about her doesn't feel right." "Don't be stupid," Malik snapped. "She's just another rich woman who won't miss a few dollars. Stick to the plan." They watched as the woman handed her bag to the man, who seemed engrossed in their conversation. This was their moment. Malik nodded at Samir, and the brothers moved in perfect synchronization. The next few seconds unfolded like a scene from a heist movie. Malik swooped in first, snatching the bag with practiced ease. Samir was right behind him, ready to cover their escape. "Hey!" the man shouted, his voice breaking through the calm of the park. The boys sprinted down the street, weaving through the crowd with the agility of seasoned thieves. People turned to watch, some shouting in alarm, others too stunned to react. The man took a step forward, as if to chase them, but stopped when he noticed the lady's expression. She hadn't moved. Her gaze followed the boys, cold and calculating, but her body remained still. "Are you just going to let them go?" the man asked, his voice trembling with frustration. The lady smiled faintly, a smile that sent a shiver down his spine. "They won't get far," she said, her voice as soft as a lullaby but carrying an unshakable certainty. "What do you mean?" She turned to face him, her eyes glinting with an otherworldly light. "Watch," she said simply. The man stood frozen, his mind racing. There was something in her tone that made him feel as though he was standing at the edge of a great abyss, staring into the unknown. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the air around them grew colder, and a strange fog began to creep into the park. The city's usual chaos seemed to fade into the background, replaced by an eerie silence. And then, the lady spoke. The man stood in stunned silence as the strange lady's eyes followed the fleeing boys. There was no panic in her demeanor, no anger, just a serene, almost unsettling calm. Her long fingers traced an invisible pattern in the air, and for a moment, the world seemed to pause around her. "You're just going to let them go?" the man asked, his voice breaking the tense silence. "They won't get far," she said softly, her words laced with a mysterious certainty. The man frowned. "But they—" "Shush," she interrupted, holding up a hand. "Watch and learn." Her voice dropped to a whisper, speaking words the man couldn't quite catch. They weren't in any language he recognized. Ancient, foreign, and otherworldly, the words flowed from her lips like a chant. As she spoke, the air around her seemed to change. The streetlights flickered erratically, and the air grew heavy, almost suffocating. A sharp wind swept through the park, scattering leaves in its wake. It wasn't natural, this wind didn't touch the trees or stir the grass. It swirled solely around the lady, wrapping her in an invisible cocoon of power. "Cain," she whispered, her voice carrying a strange resonance. "Wanderer, outcast, cursed eternal. I summon thee." The ground beneath them seemed to hum, a low vibration that sent shivers up the man's spine. The fog that had begun to creep into the park thickened, swirling at her feet like obedient serpents. The man took an instinctive step back. He wasn't a particularly religious man, but he had heard enough stories growing up to know when something wasn't of this world. Cain, he repeated hesitantly. You mean Cain from the Bible? The lady didn't answer him directly. Instead, her eyes locked onto the horizon where the boys had disappeared. Her lips curled into a faint, knowing smile. She raised her hand, palm outward, as though she were pressing against an invisible barrier. Her fingers moved with deliberate precision, tracing strange, glowing symbols in the air. The symbols shimmered briefly before dissolving into the fog. The man watched in disbelief as the fog began to move, stretching and twisting like it had a mind of its own. It slithered along the ground, following the same path the boys had taken. What are you doing? He asked, his voice trembling. She glanced at him briefly, her expression unreadable. Calling back what belongs to me. Her tone was calm, almost conversational, but it carried an undeniable weight. The man's heart pounded in his chest. He wanted to run, to get as far away from this woman as possible, but his legs refused to move. The fog reached the boys quickly. Malik and Samir, who had been celebrating their success, suddenly felt an unnatural chill. It wasn't the kind of cold that came from the wind or the weather. This was deeper, penetrating their bones and wrapping around their hearts. Malik, Samir said, his voice shaking. Do you feel that? Feel what? Malik snapped, though his bravado was beginning to waver. The fog curled around their legs like ghostly chains, and an overwhelming sense of dread washed over them. Malik tried to take another step forward but found that his feet wouldn't move. What's happening? He shouted, panic creeping into his voice. Samir grabbed his brother's arm, his eyes wide with terror. It's her. It's the lady. Back in the park, a small crowd had gathered, drawn by the strange events unfolding. People whispered among themselves, some clutching their phones to record the scene, while others debated whether to intervene. Is this some kind of performance art? One onlooker asked. No way, another replied. Look at the fog. That's not normal. A woman clutched her child protectively. She's not human, she whispered, crossing herself. The man standing beside the lady could only stare, his mind racing. He wanted to dismiss it all as a trick, a clever illusion, but deep down, he knew better. The strange lady lowered her hand, her lips curling into a satisfied smile. It's done, she said softly. What's done? The man asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. She turned to him, her piercing gaze locking onto his. They're coming back, she said simply. As if on cue, distant cries echoed through the fog. The sound grew louder, closer, until the silhouettes of the two boys emerged. They were stumbling, their faces pale with terror. Malik and Samir tried to resist, but their bodies weren't their own. Every step they took felt like they were being dragged by invisible chains. I don't want to go back, Samir cried, tears streaming down his face. We have to, Malik shouted, though he didn't sound convinced. His voice trembled as he added, she's controlling us. The fog thickened around them, making it impossible to see anything beyond a few feet. All they could hear was the sound of their own labored breathing and the faint, melodic hum of the lady's chant still echoing in their ears. When the boys finally reached the park, they fell to their knees in front of the lady, dropping her bag at her feet. Their hands shook, and they couldn't bring themselves to meet her gaze. Take it, Malik said, his voice barely above a whisper. Take it and let us go. The lady knelt down, retrieving her bag with deliberate grace. I don't tolerate thieves, she said, her tone calm but chilling. You should consider this a lesson. Samir looked up at her, his face streaked with tears. Who are you? He asked, his voice trembling. The lady smiled, a slow, enigmatic smile that revealed nothing and everything at once. You don't need to know who I am, she said. You only need to know this. The world is full of rules, and you've just broken one of the oldest. As she spoke, the fog began to dissipate, and the oppressive weight in the air lifted. The boys scrambled to their feet, their bodies finally free to move. Without another word, they turned and ran as fast as they could, disappearing into the night. The man stared at the lady, his mind struggling to process what he had just witnessed. What was that? He asked, his voice barely audible. The lady turned to him, her expression serene once more. A reminder, she said cryptically, before walking away into the fading mist, leaving the man and the crowd with more questions than answers. The fog lingered in the park, curling around the lampposts like a silent spectator. The crowd remained frozen in place, whispering in hushed tones about the strange woman and the boys who had returned what they stole. Most were too terrified to intervene, while others clutched their phones, unsure whether they were witnessing a miracle or something far darker. The man who stood beside the woman could feel the sweat trickling down his back, even in the cold. His voice trembled as he finally spoke. What did you do to them? What, **you? The woman did not answer immediately. Her gaze remained fixed on the horizon where the boys had fled, though her voice, soft and serene, broke the silence. Do you know the story of Cain, the first murderer? The man blinked, caught off guard by the sudden shift in conversation. Cain? From the Bible? He took a hesitant step back, as though the mention of the name itself carried a weight he could not bear. The woman's lips curved into a faint smile. The very same. Banished by God, cursed to wander the earth for eternity, marked so no one would kill him. But his curse carried more than solitude, it bound him to justice of an ancient kind. When invoked, he brings back balance where it has been stolen. The man frowned, trying to process her words. Are you saying, you summoned Cain? Like, the actual Cain? The woman turned to him, her piercing eyes meeting his. They were no longer just human eyes, they seemed to hold the weight of oceans, vast and endless. Cain is bound to the laws of the unseen world. Thievery and betrayal call to him like a moth to a flame. But he cannot come unbidden. Someone must invoke him. The man felt a chill run through him. The wind picked up again, stirring the fog into spirals that danced at the woman's feet. And you can do that. She tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. It's not a matter of can. It's a matter of should. Those boys broke a rule older than this city, older than mankind. They thought they could take what wasn't theirs and escape unscathed. They were wrong. The woman stepped forward, her white gown billowing around her like smoke. She raised her hands, her fingers tracing patterns in the air that glowed faintly before vanishing into the mist. Her voice dropped into a low, melodic chant, the words thick with power and mystery. The crowd shivered as the atmosphere changed again. The air grew heavier, suffused with an energy that pressed down on their chests. Those who had been recording the scene found their phones glitching, the screens flickering before shutting off entirely. The man stumbled back, his breath quickening. What are you doing now? The woman didn't look at him. Her chant grew louder, more forceful, as though she were summoning something from the depths of the earth itself. The fog thickened, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. Somewhere in the distance, a low rumble echoed, like the sound of approaching thunder. Cain, she called again, her voice echoing unnaturally. Wanderer, outcast, cursed eternal. Hear me now. I summon thee to reclaim what is owed. Bind those who dare to defy the laws of balance. Bring them back to face their judgment. Suddenly, the ground trembled beneath their feet. The man cried out, clutching a nearby bench for support. The fog began to swirl violently, forming a vortex that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. From within the vortex, a figure began to emerge. It was a shadow at first, tall and imposing, its features indistinct. But as it stepped forward, it became clear that this was no ordinary figure. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes burned with a fiery red light. Around its neck was a dark mark, resembling a scar that pulsed faintly. The crowd gasped in unison, some backing away while others dropped to their knees in fear. Even the man, who had tried to maintain some semblance of control, found himself trembling uncontrollably. The figure turned its gaze toward the woman, inclining its head in acknowledgement. You have summoned me, it said, its voice deep and resonant, as though it came from the earth itself. The woman nodded. They have stolen what does not belong to them. Bring them back. Cain tilted his head slightly, as though considering her request. Then, without another word, he turned and walked into the fog. With each step, The ground seemed to quake, the fog parting before him like a curtain. Miles away, Malik and Samir had finally slowed down, their stolen loot clutched tightly in their hands. They were laughing, though their voices carried a nervous edge. "I told you we'd get away," Malik said, though his eyes darted around nervously. "That lady didn't even try to stop us. She probably didn't even know what happened." Samir wasn't so sure. He felt a strange unease, like they were being watched. "Malik, I think we should get rid of the bag. Something feels wrong." Malik scoffed. "Don't be ridiculous. This is worth thousands. We can sell the phones and the money." His words were cut off as the air around them grew cold, unnaturally so. The fog that had clung to the park was now creeping into the narrow alley where they stood. It moved with purpose, swirling around their feet and tightening like shackles. "Malik," Samir whispered, his voice shaking. "What is this?" Before Malik could answer, a deep, resonant voice echoed through the alley. "You have taken what is not yours." The brothers turned, their eyes widening in horror as they saw the figure emerging from the fog. Cain's fiery gaze locked onto them, and they felt an invisible force pressing down on them, immobilizing their bodies. "No, no," Malik shouted, struggling against the unseen chains that bound him. "Please, let us go." Cain stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "You were given a choice. You chose greed. Now, you will face the consequences." The boys felt their bodies move against their will, dragged backward by an invisible force. The bag, still clutched in Malik's hand, seemed to grow heavier with each step. They cried out, pleading for mercy, but Cain's expression remained impassive. As they stumbled back toward the park, the fog seemed to guide them, pulling them closer to the woman who had summoned their judgment. When the boys finally reappeared in the park, their faces were pale, their bodies trembling. The crowd gasped as they dropped to their knees before the woman, returning the bag without a word. Cain stood silently behind them, his presence as imposing as ever. The woman regarded them with a cold, calculating gaze. "Balance has been restored," she said simply, her voice echoing in the now silent park.
Please subscribe to our YouTube channel for more stories.